The holding pen smelled like ozone and something Marin Voss couldn't name. A sweetness that sat wrong on the tongue, fruit left to rot in a sterile room. She'd been in Bay 14 for 31 days. She knew because she'd scratched a mark into the polymer wall every time the overhead lights cycled from blue to amber and back again. And there were 31 marks now, a tiny constellation of stubbornness that no one but her would ever read. Around her, the acquisition center hummed with commerce. The Tavari ran it with the same bureaucratic efficiency they applied to everything. Climate-controlled, enclosures sorted by species, neural-tagged catalogs, holographic displays rotating slowly above each bay to advertise the contents within. Bay 12 held a pair of Osk, thick-limbed and silent, their chitinous backs catching the light like wet stone. Bay 9 had something Marin had never seen before. A creature with translucent skin and 6 arms that moved in slow hypnotic circles, folding and unfolding like a flower deciding whether to bloom. The holographic label above its enclosure read Skilled Manipulator. Fine Assembly, Certified. Marin's label read Human, Terran, General Purpose Uncertified. She'd stopped looking at it weeks ago. The buyers came in waves. Morning shifts brought corporate procurement officers with their data slates and scanning wands, sizing up the Osk for mining contracts or evaluating neural compatibility scores on the translator species in Bay 3. Afternoons were slower. Private buyers, hobbyists, the occasional research outfit looking for something exotic to study. They drifted past Marin's Bay, the way people in a pet store drift past the fish tanks, after the puppies have already caught their eye. A glance? Maybe 2, a flicker of mild curiosity, then on to something more useful. A Kethri diplomat paused once, long enough for Marin to straighten up and press her palms flat against the transparent wall. She tried to look alert, capable. The diplomat consulted his data slate, his crest feathers rippling with what Marin had learned to recognize as disinterest. He moved on. A Tavari and Mining Guild insignia stopped the next day. He looked at Marin, then at the catalog entry floating beside her head. Uncertified for what? Exactly, he asked the attendant. Everything, the attendant said, with the particular tone of someone stating the obvious to someone determined to be dense. No neural interface compatibility, no psionic bandwidth, no environmental hardening. They breathe a very narrow atmospheric mix, fragile skeletal structure, moderate intelligence, but the cognition architecture is. He made a gesture Marin didn't recognize, something dismissive. The Mining Guild Tavari walked away without another word. Research group came through on the 14th day. 3 Tavari in matching academic sashes, scanning each bay with instruments that hummed at different pitches. Depending on what they found, they spent 20 minutes with the 6-armed creature in Bay 9. They spent 4 minutes with the Osk. They spent exactly 11 seconds on Marin. One of them dictated notes into a neural recorder without looking at her. Terran specimen, physiologically unremarkable. Neural architecture incompatible with standard interface protocols. No psionic signature detected. Manual dexterity noted, but not commercially viable. Commendation, pass. The word pass hung in the air like a door closing. On the 17th day a child came, a young Tavari, crest feathers still soft and unridged, tugged along by what Marin assumed was a parent. The child stopped in front of 14, and feet stared at Marin with the unfiltered intensity that children of every species seem to share. Marin stared back. The child pressed both hands against the transparent wall. Marin slowly pressed her own hands against the wall from the inside, lining them up, her 5 fingers against the child's 4. The proportions wrong, the gesture unmistakable. The child's crest feathers, lifted in what Marin had learned, was delight. Then the parent pulled the child away, murmuring something too quick for the distance. And they were gone, and the handprints faded from the wall, and Marin sat back down. Marin sat down on the bench in her bay, pressed her back against the wall, and stared at the marks she'd scratched there. 31. She wondered, not for the first time, how many more she'd make before someone decided to recycle her, or ship her back to whatever processing facility handled the unclaimed inventory. She was thinking about the 30-second mark, whether to scratch it now or wait for the light cycle, whether it mattered, whether anything about this ritual mattered when the old woman appeared. She was Tavari. That much was obvious. The elongated skull, the wide-set eyes with their double lids, the skin that shifted between slate gray and a pale, luminous blue depending on the angle. She was old in a way that Marin could read even across species lines. There was a careful quality to her movements, a deliberateness that spoke of joints that no longer cooperated automatically, of a body requiring negotiation to cross a room. She leaned on a staff that pulsed with soft light at its tip. Not a weapon, Marin thought. A mobility aid, the Tavari equivalent of a cane. She stopped in front of Bay 14. Marin didn't stand up this time. She'd learned that standing up only extended the duration of the pause before. The buyer moved on, and the longer the pause lasted, the worse the moving on felt afterward. So she sat and looked at the old woman, and the old woman looked at her, and for a moment neither of them did anything at all. This one, the old woman said. The attendant materialized beside her, data slate already active. The Terran? Ma'am, I should mention. The compatibility ratings are quite low. General domestic assistance, I'd recommend the Shireni in Bay. I said this one. The attendant hesitated. Marin watched his crest feathers perform a complicated dance between professional obligation and the desire not to argue with the customer. The customer won. Of course. I'll prepare the documentation. 20 minutes later, Marin Voss walked out of Bay 14 for the last time. The old woman, her owner, she had to get used to that word, moved ahead of her at the pace of someone who had stopped hurrying a long time ago. Outside, the acquisition center's lights gave way to the pale amber sky of Sethani, and Marin breathed air that wasn't recycled for the first time in 31 days. It tasted like copper and cold rain. My name is Ilesi, the old woman said without turning around. You will live in my home. There is a room you may use. Don't touch anything you don't understand. Marin opened her mouth. The words that wanted to come out were, I'm an engineer. I was trained in structural systems and environmental controls. I can fix things, build things, solve problems you haven't even identified yet. Give me a task. Any task. Please. What she said was, thank you. Ilesi made a sound. A short vibrating hum that Marin's newly implanted translator couldn't quite parse. It might have been acknowledgement. It might have been the Tavari equivalent of a shrug. The translator had been installed at the center's medical bay before departure. A small device, pressed against the bone behind Marin's left ear, its filaments threading into the auditory cortex with a pain that was brief and precise, being stung by a very deliberate insect. It let her understand spoken Tavari mostly. The nuances bled away. She could catch words but not music, meaning but not texture. Ilesi's home sat at the edge of a settlement that clung to the slope of a low mesa. The house was old in the way Ilesi was old. Worn but maintained, its surfaces carrying the patina of long use without decay. The architecture was Tavari standard. Flowing walls, integrated light panels, rooms that transitioned into each other without hard boundaries. The main living space centered on a curved seating area that faced a wall-sized display screen. A small garden alcove opened to the amber sky through a retractable membrane. The environmental systems hummed steadily in registers too low for Marin to consciously hear, but just present enough to feel in her chest. Her room was off the main corridor. It was small, a sleeping platform, a sanitation unit, a narrow window that looked out onto the mesa's western face. The light that came through it was the color of rust and honey. You may eat from the dispensary in the kitchen alcove, Ilesi said from the doorway. The system has been updated with your nutritional requirements. I will not always be available to speak with you. That last sentence, Marin would come to understand, was the most honest thing Ilesi ever said to her. The first week, Marin explored every inch of the home she was permitted to access. She mapped it in her mind the way she'd mapped maintenance corridors on the colony. Ship, power junctions here, water reclamation there, the environmental control hub behind a panel in the kitchen alcove, comms array integrated into the wall beside Ilesi's seating area. Her engineer's eye cataloged everything. The airline, crack in the garden alcove's membrane seal, the slight irregularity in the lighting cycle that suggested a degrading control module. The floor heating in the corridor ran warmer on the left side than the right, indicating an imbalance in the thermal distribution grid. She noted all of it. She fixed none of it. She hadn't been asked. Ilesi's days followed a rhythm as precise and unvarying as the light cycle in Bay. Teen. She woke early, took medication from a dispenser beside her sleeping area, tended her garden for exactly the length of time it took Marin to eat breakfast, then settled into the curved seating area and activated the display. The programs she watched were, as far as Marin could tell, soap operas. They were Tavari soap operas, which meant they were performed by Tavari actors, whose skin-light patterns conveyed emotional subtlety that Marin's eyes couldn't decode, accompanied by dialogue that her translator rendered in flat, stripped-down phrases that made every dramatic revelation sound like a weather report. Character A had betrayed Character B. Character C was secretly the offspring of Character D. Someone's bioluminescence was fading, apparently meant they were dying or lying or both. Ilesi watched these programs for hours. Crest feathers, shorter and thinner than a younger Tavari's, more gray than silver, would occasionally ripple in response to a plot development. Sometimes she made that short, vibrating hum. Sometimes she spoke back to the screen in low, rapid Tavari that Marin's translator gave up on entirely, rendering it as untranslatable, colloquial emotional. Marin sat in her room and listened through the wall. On the 9th day, she positioned herself in the corridor where she could see the main display, and she watched along. Ilesi didn't acknowledge her presence. Marin watched anyway. She couldn't follow the bioluminescent subtext, but she could read the body language, the way a character turned away at the moment of confrontation, the way two actors stood just slightly too close together in a scene that was supposed to be casual. Drama was drama. Humans had been watching it for 10,000 years. After the program ended, Ilesi stood, shuffled past Marin without a word, and went to bed. Marin went back to her room and scratched a mark on the wall. The weeks calcified into routine. Ilesi's routine. Marin existed within it the way a piece of furniture exists within a room. Present, accounted for, serving no function anyone could articulate but somehow too much trouble to remove. Ilesi fed her, housed her, occasionally directed a remark toward her that was less conversation than thinking aloud. The garden membrane is leaking again, Ilesi might say, and Marin would open her mouth to offer to repair it. And Ilesi would already be calling the maintenance service through her neural interface, the request sent and acknowledged before Marin's first word had formed. That was the thing about the Tavari. About all of them, every species Marin had encountered since the colony ship's interception. They didn't use their hands the way humans did. Not really. Oh, they had hands. The Tavari had 4 long fingers and an opposable thumb on each hand, perfectly functional for gripping and gesturing. But the heavy lifting of their civilization ran through neural interfaces. Communication, data storage, environmental control, medical monitoring, commerce, navigation, all of it flowed through the implants that every Tavari received at birth, invisible threads connecting each individual to the vast informational architecture of their society. Their hands were for touching, for greeting, tending gardens. They were not, and had not been for generations, for working. Marin's hands were different. Marin's hands had calluses from tools and blisters from welding grips, and a scar across her left palm from a sharp edge on a ventilation housing she, D, repaired 3 years ago on the colony ship. Her hands had built things and broken things and written things down, and now they did nothing. And the nothing was so loud it kept her awake at night. She started small, invisible acts. The loose panel in the corridor that rattled when the environmental system cycled. She tightened it with her fingers, pressing until the polymer clips clicked home. The vent cover in the kitchen alcove that had accumulated a season's worth of particulate. She cleaned it with a cloth she'd fashioned from packing material. The thermal imbalance in the floor, she couldn't fix that without tools. She traced the lines of the heating grid beneath the floor panels with her fingertips, mapping the problem, understanding it, holding its shape in her mind the way she held everything now, quietly, uselessly, stubbornly. Nobody noticed. Nobody was meant to. Some nights, she sat in the garden alcove after Ilesi had gone to bed, the retractable membrane pulled back to show the alien sky. The stars here were wrong, too many, too bright, arranged in patterns that had no names she knew. She tried to find familiar constellations and couldn't, and the failure was sharper than she expected, a small grief that caught her off guard. She sat with it. She learned its shape. She added it to the collection of small griefs she was assembling, In the absence of any larger purpose, she started talking to herself. Quietly, under her breath, narrating her days the way she used to narrate maintenance procedures on the colony ship. Panel 16, Corridor Junction B, tightened to spec. Vent cover. Kitchen alcove, cleaned and reseated. Environmental control module, main hub, showing degradation pattern consistent with a capacitor drift. Note for future repair if anyone ever asks, which they won't. The sound of her own voice was a tool, same as her hands. It kept her from going silent inside. The season Marin thought of as autumn, the light cycle shortening, the amber sky deepening toward ochre, gave way to what she called winter. Wasn't cold but carried a different quality of light, thinner and more distant. Ilesi's garden produced less. The soap operas continued. Marin's mark count on the wall passed 100, and she stopped counting. The marks themselves had become less about tracking time, and more about proving she was real, that she existed, that she occupied space, that her hands could still make a mark on a surface and the mark would persist after she pulled her hand away. At night, she lay on the sleeping platform and stared at the rust-honey light from the window and imagined other lives. If she'd been bought by a military commander, she could have been useful. Humans had a gift for tactical improvisation that the more structured species found baffling, the ability to abandon a plan mid-execution and invent a new one from whatever was at hand. She'd read about it in the colony ship's historical archives. The long human tradition of winning through sheer unwillingness to accept the situation as presented. She imagined herself standing beside a Tavari general, pointing at a holomap, saying, "What if we just go through the wall instead of around it?" She imagined the general's crest feathers, flaring in surprise, then settling into something like respect. If she'd been bought by a scientist, she could have been a research partner. Human perception was different. Coarser, maybe, but differently calibrated. She saw colors the Tavari didn't name. She heard frequencies they filtered out. She smelled things, smelled them, with her nose, picking up chemical information from the air in a way the Tavari found both primitive and fascinating when they bothered to notice. She might have been the one to catch the anomaly, the off note in the data, the thing that smelled wrong before the instruments registered it. If she'd been bought by an artist, she could have been a muse or a collaborator. Human aesthetics were alien to the Tavari in a way that went deeper than biology. Humans found beauty in asymmetry, in roughness, in the imperfect mark of a hand on a surface. Tavari art was crystalline, mathematical, generated through neural harmonics. Human art was dirt and spit and charcoal on a cave wall, and it carried a voltage that no algorithm could replicate. If she'd been bought by an explorer, she could have been magnificent. Humans were built for endurance, not the strongest, not the fastest, but the most persistent. They could walk for days. They could sleep in shifts. They could eat almost anything, survive almost anywhere, adapt to conditions that would kill more specialized organisms through sheer, stubborn biological flexibility. An explorer would have seen that, would have valued it. Instead, she was here, in a small room off a corridor in an old woman's house on a border world that smelled like copper, listening to soap operas through a wall and tightening panels. Nobody asked her to tighten. She rolled over on the sleeping platform and pressed her face into the surface that didn't quite feel like a pillow and wasn't quite warm enough, and closed her eyes. The sound of Ilesi's breathing reached her from 2 rooms away, steady and slow, the rhythm of someone who had long ago accepted that the next day would be identical to this one. Marin did not cry. She had rules about that. She cried anyway. It was midway through what Marin called spring when Ilesi's offspring called. Marin was in the kitchen alcove, eating something the dispensary had produced that was technically nutritious and texturally reminiscent of wet sand, when she heard Ilesi's voice change. The flat, habitual tone she used for the soap operas sharpened into something alert. Marin set down her food and moved to the corridor. Ilesi was standing, actually standing. She rarely did during her seating area hours, in front of the comms display. A face Marin hadn't seen before filled the screen. Younger Tavari, male, with the sharper crest line and brighter bioluminescence of someone in their middle years. He was speaking rapidly. New defense frequency. Mother. The border patrols have restructured after the incursion reports. You need to store this. I have the old frequency. The old frequency routes. through Waystation Kellis, and Kellis is being decommissioned. This is the new direct line to the emergency medical and security grid for your district. If anything happens, a raid, a medical event, systems failure, this is what you use. Ren, I've lived on this mesa for 40 years. Nothing happens on this mesa. Mother, store the frequency. Ilesi closed her eyes. Both sets of lids, the translucent inner ones and the outer ones, and Marin saw the familiar micro. Stillness that meant a Tavari was accessing their neural interface. Then Ilesi opened her eyes and made a sound that Marin's translator rendered as "tration," mild profanity. It won't hold. The buffer is full or corrupt, I can't tell which. Then get your interface serviced. The next service appointment is in 12 days. Reen's crest feathers flattened. Mother, I'm deploying to the outer ring tomorrow. I won't be reachable. You need this frequency before I go. Can you? Is there any way to store it externally? Alessi looked around her living space the way someone looks around a room when they've been asked for a tool they don't own. External storage. In a world where everything lived inside your head, the concept was almost quaint. Her gaze passed over the furniture, the garden alcove, the entertainment display, and then, as if remembering for the first time that furniture could be alive, landed on Marin. Marin was standing in the corridor. She had not been invited into this conversation. She had not been invited into anything in months. You, Ilesi said. The human, can you? She paused, searching for the right concept. Can you hold information? Outside your... She gestured at her own head. Outside? Marin understood before the translator finished parsing. Her heart rate climbed. Hands. Her useless, calloused, scar-mapped hands opened at her sides. I can write it down, she said. Write, make marks. On a surface. That represent the information. I can read them back later. As many times as you need. Ilesi stared at her. On the screen, Ren stared at her. Marin felt the strangeness of the moment from their side. A creature offering to store data by scratching symbols onto a physical surface, like some kind of cave ritual. But the strangeness didn't matter. What mattered was that Ilesi's neural buffer was full, and Ren was deploying. Tomorrow and the frequency needed to live somewhere. Do it, Ilesi said. Marin moved fast. She grabbed the cloth she used for cleaning vents, projected it, looked around, and found a smooth, flat piece of structural polymer she'd pried loose from a defunct wall panel weeks ago and kept in room for no reason she could name, or every reason. She found a marking stylus in the kitchen alcove's utility drawer, tool designed for labeling storage containers, and she held it the way she'd held pens and pencils and markers her entire life. So natural it was the most filth thing in 12 light years. Read it to me, she said. Ren read the frequency, slowly, character by character. Pausing between each group, Marin wrote. The stylus moved across the polymer surface with a faint scratching sound, a sound. Primitive, so wonderfully analog that it felt almost sacred. The scratch of a point on a surface, the oldest technology in the universe. The one that predated every neural interface, every quantum processor, every faster-than-light communication array ever built. A mark, on a thing, made by a hand. Marin felt the universe tilt under her feet because she was writing. She was making marks that meant something. She was doing the thing her species had been doing, since the first human pressed a reed into wet clay and said, "This matters, remember this." Hand was steady. Her breathing was not. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips where they gripped the stylus, and the pulse was saying alive, alive, alive. It took 11 seconds, 43 characters, an emergency frequency for the Sethani District Border Defense and Medical Grid. Marin read it back. Ren confirmed it. Ilesi watched Marin's hand, the hand holding the stylus. The fingers curled around it, with practiced ease, with an expression Marin couldn't read. It might have been the way you watch a pet do an unexpected trick. It might have been something else. Good, Ilesi said. The word came out softer than Marin expected. Ren signed off. The display went dark. Ilesi settled back into her seating area. Within 10 minutes, the soap opera was playing again, and the moment might never have happened at all. Shh. But Marin took the piece of polymer back to her room and held it against her chest, the way you hold a letter from someone you love. 43 characters. The first mark she'd made in 5 months that anyone had asked for. The first time her hands had mattered. She placed it on the shelf beside her sleeping platform. propped upright so she could see it from the bed. She read it to herself 3 times before she slept. Not because she needed to memorize it. She already had, the moment the stylus first touched the surface. But because reading it felt like breathing after being underwater for a very long time. The days after were the same as the days before, and they weren't. Ilesi didn't give her another task. The soap operas continued. The garden grew. Marin cleaned vents and tightened panels, and ate wet sand from the dispensary. But something had shifted in the architecture of her waiting. A keystone had been placed. And even if the arch wasn't finished, the shape of what it might become was suddenly visible. She caught Ilesi glancing at her hands sometimes. Not often, not long, but the glances were there, and they carried a quality of attention that hadn't existed before. Marin's hands, resting on a surface, wrapped around up, wiping down a vent. Ilesi watched them the way you might watch a tool whose purpose you were only beginning to understand. Marin watched back. She had learned Ilesi's rhythm so thoroughly by now that she could predict the old woman's movements by sound alone. The particular shuffle of her feet on the corridor floor, the vibration hum she made when a soap opera plot displeased her, the soft click of her medication dispenser at morning and evening. Marin knew when Ilesi's breathing changed during the night, knew the exact duration of her garden routine, knew which programs made her crest feathers ripple, and which ones made her still. She knew Ilesi the way you know a house you've lived in for years. By its sounds, its rhythms, the particular way it settles when the temperature drops. So when the sound changed, Marin knew instantly. It was late. The light cycle had shifted to its amber night mode, and Ilesi had retired to her sleeping area an hour earlier. Marin was on her platform, not sleeping. She rarely slept deeply on Sethani. The gravity was slightly wrong, and the air tasted like something she couldn't stop noticing. When she heard it, a break in the rhythm. Ilesi's breathing hitched, stuttered, then accelerated into something shallow and desperate. Thud, soft but wrong, the sound of a body meeting a wall or a floor when the body had not chosen to. Marin was moving before the sound finished. She found Ilesi in the corridor between her sleeping area and the main room. The old woman was on the floor, her back against the wall, one hand pressed to her chest. Her skin, normally that shifting slate gray to blue, had gone pale, almost white, and her bioluminescent patterns were flickering erratically. Strobing in patterns Marin had never seen. Distress signals firing in a language written in light that needed no translator to read. Ilesi, Marin dropped to her knees beside her. "What's happening?" Ilesi's mouth moved. The sound that came out was thin and broken, and Marin's translator gave her cardiac vascular event critical. The old woman's double eyelids fluttered. Her fingers scraped against the floor in small, aimless arcs. Marin had seen people die. On the colony ship, during the interception, the hull breach in Corridor 7, decompression event in the aft section. She'd seen the particular looseness that comes over a face when the thing behind it starts to leave. She saw it now in Ilesi's face, and something inside her, something older than engineering training, older than colony protocols, older than fear, locked into place like a circuit closing. "I'm going to help you. Stay with me." She reached for the comms display in the main room. It was dark. She pressed the activation surface, the way she'd seen Ilesi do 100 times, but nothing happened. Of course nothing happened. The comms were neural linked. They responded to Ilesi's interface, Ilesi's biometric signature. Without Ilesi's conscious neural handshake, the system was inert, a beautiful, useless wall. Marin tried the environmental controls. Locked. The medical alert system. Locked. The door to the garden alcove. Locked. Everything in this house ran through Ilesi's neural interface, and Ilesi's neural interface was failing along with the body it was bonded to. The home had become a sealed box, elegant and impenetrable, every system deaf to anyone who couldn't speak its invisible language. Marin pressed her palms flat against the comms display and felt the utter, specific helplessness of standing in a room full of tools you cannot lift. Then she stopped. She breathed. She thought about the house the way she'd thought about the colony ship. As a system, as a collection of interconnected components designed by engineers who, no matter how advanced, had to account for failure modes. Every system had a failure mode, and every failure mode had a bypass, the hardwired terminal. She'd seen it weeks ago during one of her restless explorations. A small panel recessed into the wall near the main entrance, almost hidden behind an ornamental screen. Old tech, backup tech. The kind of thing that gets installed when a settlement is first built and then gotten about for decades, because the primary systems never fail, except when they do. It was a manual input terminal connected directly to the settlement's emergency grid through physical cabling, completely independent of neural interfaces. It was there for exactly this scenario: total neural system failure. The only problem was that it required manual input. Physical characters entered by hand, one at a time. The Tavari hadn't entered data by hand in generations. Their fingers knew how to touch, how to gesture, how to tend gardens. But the precise, rapid, sequential motor control required to input a 43-character frequency string into a manual terminal. That skill had atrophied out of the species 100 years ago. It wasn't in their muscle memory, it wasn't in their culture, it wasn't even, Marin suspected, in their imagination as a thing a person might need to do. But it was in Marin's hands. She was already running. Room was 4 seconds away. The piece of polymer was on the shelf where she'd left it. She grabbed it, felt its weight, its realness, the slight roughness where her stylus marks had etched into the surface, and ran back. The terminal was behind the ornamental screen, exactly where she remembered. She pulled the screen aside. The panel was there, small, rectangular, dusty with disuse. Its interface a grid of physical keys, marked with Tavari characters she'd spent months learning to read because she'd had nothing else to do, and stubbornness was the only currency she had left. She powered it on. The screen lit up, a pale, anemic green, ancient by Tavari standards, beautiful to Marin because it was alive and it was responding to her touch. A faint electrical smell rose from the casing, the scent of circuits waking up after a long sleep. Enter emergency frequency, the screen read. Below the prompt, a blinking cursor waited. Behind her, in the corridor, Ilesi's breathing was getting thinner. The bioluminescent flickering was slowing. Marin didn't turn around. She couldn't afford to. She had maybe minutes, maybe less. The keypad was laid out in Tavari alphanumerics, 47 characters arranged in a pattern that bore no resemblance to any human keyboard. But Marin had spent months in this house with nothing to do but watch, and read, and memorize. She'd learned the Tavari character set the way a prisoner learns the cracks in their cell wall. Not by choice but by proximity, not by design but by the relentless accumulation of time with nothing else to look at. She knew where each character sat. She'd traced them with her eyes on every display, every label, every container in Ilesi's kitchen alcove. She looked at the polymer sheet in her left hand. 43 characters, written in her own handwriting, in a script she'd learned by osmosis, during months of invisible observation. Her handwriting. The marks her hand had made on the day Ilesi had looked at her and said, "Do it." And for 11 seconds, Marin had been a person instead of furniture. She placed her right hand on the keys. Her fingers knew what to do. They had always known. This was what human hands were built for. Not just gripping, not just touching, but encoding meaning into the physical world, translating thought into marks and marks into action. 10,000 years of writing, typing, carving, tapping, keying, entering, recording. 10,000 years of making the invisible visible, of giving information a body it could live in when the mind that held it was no longer enough. First character went in clean. The terminal chimed. Second character. Third. Index finger found each key without hunting. The layout was alien, but the act of pressing a key, of committing a symbol to a system, was as human as breathing. She fell into a rhythm, read from the sheet, find the key, press, confirm the chime, next character. Left hand held the polymer steady. Her right hand danced. It wasn't graceful, it was precise, mechanical. The movements of a woman who had repaired circuit boards and wired junction boxes and threaded cables through maintenance shafts with her fingertips. In the dark. 20th character. 21st. Behind her, she heard a sound from Ilesi, a low, rattling exhalation that made something inside Marin's chest seize. She did not stop. She could not stop. Frequency was the only thing between this moment and the one where she knelt beside a body instead of a person. 35th character. 6th. Her fingers were sweating. The keys were smooth and slightly concave, designed for Tavari finger pads, and her human fingertips were wider, blunter, but they fit. They fit because fitting was what human hands did. They adapted. They adjusted. They made do with tools that were never designed for them and got the job done anyway. 43 characters. 11 seconds the first time she'd written them. 9 seconds now. She pressed the transmission key. The terminal hummed. The screen displayed. Frequency accepted. Emergency signal transmitted. Response incoming. Marin exhaled. The air came out of her in a shudder that started in her chest and didn't stop until it reached her fingertips. Still resting on the keys, she turned and went back to Alessi. The old woman was still on the floor. Her breathing was a thread. Marin knelt beside her, lifted Alessi's head gently, so gently, and placed it in her lap. Alessi's skin was cool and papery under Marin's fingers. The bioluminescence had faded to a dim, irregular pulse like a candle guttering in a draft. "Help is coming," Marin said. "I sent the signal. Frequency Reen gave us. I wrote it down, remember? I wrote it down, and I just entered it into the emergency terminal. And they're coming. They're on their way." She didn't know if Alessi could hear her. She talked anyway, because that was what humans did. They filled silence with sound. They bridged the gap between terror and comfort with the imperfect, beautiful tool of the voice. She talked about the frequency, about the terminal, about the marks on the polymer sheet. She talked about the marks on the wall of Bay 14, 31 scratches that nobody would ever see. She talked about the colony ship, about the ventilation housing that had given her the scar on her palm, about the way Earth's sky looked at dawn in the place where she'd grown up. Orange at the horizon, then blue, then a blue so deep it was almost purple, and how she used to think the sky was holding its breath in that moment between colors. She was still talking when the emergency medical team arrived. They came through the front entrance, overriding the neural locks with equipment Marin didn't recognize, and they moved with the fluid, coordinated efficiency of beings accustomed to saving lives. They had Alessi on a stabilization platform within seconds, their instruments pulsing and chiming, their crest feathers flat with focus. One of them, a younger Tavari with quick hands and a no-nonsense energy, glanced at Marin kneeling on the floor, then at the open terminal panel by the entrance, then back at Marin. "You entered the frequency manually?" she asked. "Yes." The crest feathers did something Marin had never seen. A rapid, involuntary ripple that started at the base and traveled to the tips. A shiver. The translator didn't try to parse it. It didn't need to. Some reactions are universal. Her interface was down, Marin said. Everything was locked. The hardwired terminal was the only. "I know what it is," the medic said. "I've never seen anyone use one." She looked at Marin's hands. The right one still faintly marked with dust from the terminal keys. The left one still holding the polymer sheet with its 43 handwritten characters. "You wrote the frequency." On that, her son gave it to her. Her neural buffer couldn't store it. "So I wrote it down." The medic looked at the polymer sheet for a long moment. Then she looked at Marin, with an expression that Marin's translator couldn't parse, and Marin's gut could. It was the expression of someone recalibrating everything they thought they knew about the creature standing in front of them. "Taking her to the district medical center. She's stabilized." "You," the medic paused. "You should come." Marin rode in the medical transport with Alessi's hand in hers. The old woman was unconscious, her vitals held steady by the stabilization field. Bioluminescence reduced to a slow, rhythmic pulse that the medic said was good, was recovery, was the body finding its way back. Marin held her hand anyway. It felt like the right thing to do. Alessi's fingers were longer than hers. Cooler, the joints articulated differently. But a hand was a hand. A grip was a grip. Marin had learned that some things translate without a device. The transport hummed through the amber sky. Small side window. Marin could see the mesa dropping away below them. Alessi's house shrinking to a pale dot against the ochre rock. She wondered how the house looked right now. The lights still flickering in their distress patterns. The emergency terminal's green screen still glowing. The ornamental screen askew where Marin had shoved it aside. She wondered if the polymer sheet was still on the floor where she dropped it after entering the last character, if one of the medics had picked it up. She tightened her grip on Alessi's hand. Not hard, just enough to say, "I'm here. I'm still here." One of the medics, the one who had not examined the terminal, kept glancing at Marin throughout the transport. Not with suspicion or curiosity, but with something more unsettling. The particular attention of someone who is filing away an experience they expect to tell other people about. Marin was used to being looked through. Being looked at like she was a story someone would retell was a new and uncomfortable sensation. The medical center was bright and efficient, and smelled like nothing at all, which after months of copper and rain was disorienting. They took Sissy to a treatment bay and asked Marin to wait in a corridor. She waited. She was good at waiting. She'd had practice. Hours passed. Marin sat on a bench designed for Taveri bodies, her feet not quite reaching the floor, and she held the polymer sheet in both hands and read the 43 characters over and over, the way a person reads a prayer. Not for information, for the comfort of something solid in a world that keeps shifting. A doctor came out eventually. The vascular event was severe, she said, addressing Marin with the careful attention of someone who has been briefed on an unusual situation. Without the emergency signal, the delay would have been. She stopped, recalibrated. She would not have survived. The response window for this type of event is very narrow. She'll be okay, she will recover. She'll need time and monitoring, but yes, she'll recover. Marin nodded. She didn't trust herself to speak for a moment, so she just nodded. And the doctor watched her with that same recalibrating expression the medic had, worn. And then the doctor said, quietly, "The terminal hadn't been used in this district in over 60 years. We verified the signal log. Input was flawless." Marin looked down at her hands. The scar on her left palm, the dust from the terminal keys on her right. The polymer sheet balanced between them. 43 characters in handwriting that was not elegant, not beautiful, the product of any advanced technology. Just marks made by a human hand on a surface, because that was what human hands did. "I wrote it down," she said. "That's all, I just wrote it down." They let her see Elacy 3 days later. The recovery bay was quiet, filled with the low hum of medical systems doing patient, invisible work. Elacy was propped up in a treatment pod, her color better, shifting between her usual slate and that pale luminous blue, though she moved with even more care than before, as if her body had renegotiated its terms of operation and the new contract had stricter clauses. Marin stood in the doorway. "Come in," Elacy said. Marin came in. She sat on a stool beside the pod. They looked at each other. The silence between them was different now. Not the silence of someone ignoring a piece of furniture, but the silence of two people who have been through something together and are still finding the shape of what it left behind. "Ren contacted me," Elacy said. "He told me what happened," he said. She paused. Her crest feathers moved in a pattern Marin had never seen from her before, slow, deliberate, like someone choosing words with great care. "He said you used the manual terminal. He said you entered the frequency by hand." "Yes. He said no one has done that in 60 years, the doctor told me." I was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out. Her hand moved slowly, crossing the small distance between the pod and the stool where Marin sat. It came to rest on Marin's right hand, the hand that had held the stylus, the hand that had pressed the keys, the hand that had done the oldest, simplest, most human thing in the universe at the exact moment when the most advanced technology in the room had failed. Elacy's fingers settled over Marin's, cool and long and careful. "I bought you because you looked lonely," Elacy said. "In the facility, your bay. You were sitting against the wall, and you looked." She made the vibrating hum, and this time Marin's translator offered a tentative rendering. Recognized, kinship, solitary. "I am old and I live alone and I was not looking for useful. I was looking for." Another pause. The crest feathers moved again. "Company, even if neither of us knew how to have it." Marin felt her throat tighten. She turned her hand over beneath Elacy's, so their palms met. Human and Taveri, warm and cool, scarred and smooth. "I was useful though," Marin said. "In the end, you were more than useful." Elacy's grip tightened, not much, not painfully, but with intention, with meaning. "You were ready. When it mattered, you were ready, and I do not understand how, because I gave you nothing to be ready for." Marin thought about the marks on the wall of Bay 14, about the loose panel she'd tightened in the corridor, the vent she'd cleaned, the thermal grid she'd mapped with her fingertips in the dark, all the invisible, uncounted acts of stubborn readiness that had kept her sane and kept her sharp and kept her hands alive during the long months of silence. Humans are like that, she said. We stay ready, even when there's no reason to, especially when there's no reason to. I don't know. It's a species trait. We maintain things, we hold on, we remember numbers. Alessi made a sound that Marin's translator had never produced before. It was warm and layered, and it resonated in a frequency that Marin felt in her sternum. And the translator, after a long pause, offered laughter, affectionate. You remember numbers, Alessi repeated. We remember numbers. Outside, Marin could hear the faint sounds of the medical center's daily rhythms. Footsteps, equipment chimes, the low murmur of conversations she couldn't quite make out. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a place where people were getting better, and the getting better was so routine it didn't even register as remarkable. The attendant at the facility, Alessi said. When I bought you, he told me you were uncertified, that your species had no useful specialization, no neural interface, no psionic ability, no environmental hardening. She paused. Her fingers shifted against Marin's, finding a new position settling in. He was correct about all of those things. He was. And none of those things mattered. Marin felt the truth of that land in her chest like a stone, dropped into still water. Not a large stone. A small one. The kind that makes a sound you almost miss and then sends rings outward that change the shape of the entire surface. What mattered, Alessi continued, was that you picked up a stick and you scratched marks onto a surface, and you kept those marks safe, and then you walked to a wall and you pushed buttons with your fingers and you sent a signal to people who came and kept me alive. She said it plainly, without drama, the particular clarity of someone who has spent several days in a medical pod, thinking about the precise sequence of events that prevented them dying. Every piece of technology in my home was more advanced than what you did, and every piece of it failed. You did not. Marin didn't trust herself to speak. Ren wants to meet you properly, Alessi said. When he returns from deployment, he wants to thank you in person. He also wants to install 3 more manual terminals in my home, which I think is excessive, but he is his father's son, and his father was also excessive about safety measures. A pause. The crest feathers moved in that slow, warm pattern again. His father would have liked you. He was an engineer too, of a kind. He built things with his hands before the neural fabricators made that unnecessary. He said there was she searched for the word, honesty in it. In making something with your own body. Alessi's hand stayed on hers. Through the recovery bay's window, the amber sky of Sethani was doing something Marin hadn't seen before. The light was shifting, pulling apart into bands of color at the horizon, or at the base, then gold, then a luminous, trembling white that reminded Marin of something she'd seen a long time ago, in a different sky, on a different world. It looked like morning, like the moment between colors when the sky holds its breath. Sat beside Alessi and held her hand and watched the light change. And for the first time in a very long time, she did not need to scratch a mark on a wall to know that the day counted. It counted. Months later, Curman, officer from the district's administrative center, visited Alessi's home for a routine welfare check. He noted in his report that the human resident appeared healthy, well-integrated, and he paused over this, not sure of the correct terminology, essential. He noted that the home's environmental systems were running at unusual efficiency, several long-standing maintenance issues had been resolved, and the communication infrastructure had been upgraded to include a secondary manual, input terminals installed by the human's own hands. He also noted, in a footnote he almost deleted before deciding to leave it, that the Tavari resident and the human resident appeared to communicate with ease, often without the translation device, using a shared vocabulary of gestures, rhythms, and silences that the officer could not classify within any established interspecies communication framework. He filed the report. It disappeared into the administrative archives, where it was never read by anyone important. But in the home on the mesa, the emergency frequency still hung on the wall beside the comms display, written in a human hand on a piece of polymer. 43 characters, slightly smudged, profoundly ordinary. Alessi had framed it, not because it was advanced, not because it was remarkable by any technological standard in the known galaxy, because a woman had picked up a stylus, and she had written it down, And it had been enough. It had been enough.